I will also provide a resource at the end of a great way to kind of just jump right in and see the cultural dynamic through the eyes of someone who's part of it. We're going to cover some different topics today. First, we're going to start with some of the definition and the history of what machismo is. Then we're going to go through the positives and negatives that this culture can have on our clients. We're going to talk about Marianismo, which is the female version. So how does machismo culture play into women's roles and how women view themselves? Some of the outcomes of what happens when we don't address some of these toxic masculinity traits. And then, like I said, we'll throw in a resource, and then my sources will be at the end. So first, we're going to start with talking about what is machismo. So the history actually dates back to the Spanish conquest. So men were needing to assert their dominance to gain power over other people. These perceptions of masculinity in the Latinx culture can be traced back to maladaptive manifestations of male behavior as a direct result of violent oppression, enforced loss of language, culture, family, material possessions, freedom, and place by white supremacist heteronormative patriarchy. So this is something that we see a lot in different cultures, including also the Native American culture, where the white supremacy has really suppressed all of the other cultural aspects that other people have been prideful of in the past. And it can be really detrimental to the pride that we take in our culture and wanting to pass it down to others. There's lots of studies that talk about how much native languages have really been lost because we value assimilation over pride in our own culture and heritage. Machismo is a strong or exaggerated sense of manliness, an assumptive attitude that virility, courage, strength, and entitlement dominate other attributes of masculinity. So this culture really emphasizes courage, strength, and entitlement. It also encourages extreme masculine identity. So this isn't just looking at basic masculinity. This is looking at extreme versions of masculinity. The series of beliefs that allow for dominant attitudes and behaviors constructed to preserve and strengthen male dominance over women. And so a lot of this we'll see is that men have felt threatened both back in the Spanish conquest, and they both it also works where they're feeling like they need to have dominance over women. There may be a threat of equality there. And so they are focusing on how to gain the dominance. This can vary at different stages during life. So, it might change how it looks from somebody who's 20 years old to someone who's 40 years old to someone who's 80 years old. Machismo culture rewards men who are womanizers and are having many different partners. It's looked at as a positive if they have lots of women who are interested in them. It places them as more wanted and more higher up than other men who are just having one partner. It also places the burden of responsibility on women if they become pregnant. So women are often blamed if they become pregnant from a man, and the man doesn't necessarily always need to step up and step in when a woman is pregnant. So the social construction of masculinity that's common across Latin America and Spanish culture maps out how men should engage with their gender based on, once again, virility, courage, strength, and power. So they really are looking at this in all types of engagement, not just with sexual partners, but also with other men, with children, with even their elders. How are they seen? And this really focuses a lot on the image portrayed. Sociocultural dynamics in which Latino men learn that what it means to be a man throughout their lives has probably pushed them towards the patriarchal notions of masculinity. So what this means is that our cultures is what's passing these things down. Men in the family are passing these ideas down. Women in the family are passing these ideas down. So these are traditions that have repeatedly gone from different generations to continue to say that this is how masculinity should look. And it is a form of generational trauma as well. Machismo culture includes being courageous, showing no emotions, being in control of everything or everyone around, being the breadwinner, head of household, and decision maker of the home. So really it's this very traditional idea of what a man is to be. If you think back to, like the 1950s, this idea of what a man was to be, this is exactly that, but almost even more extreme because they're really not showing emotions, and it's really going above and beyond just this idea of being the one who's the leader of the home to the one who's completely in control of the home. They are also taught to constantly assert dominance in ways that can lead to verbal abuse, physical abuse, blackmailing, and even more. Gaslighting is another huge part of this. And so it's really important, if you feel like you have any confusion of what any of those look like, to look those up and know that they definitely have a cultural definition that's different, because what's considered gaslighting in white culture is not necessarily considered the same, because it goes so much farther because of how toxic this form of masculinity can be. So when we talk about the machismo culture, there's a lot of negatives, and I'm going to start with that because I think that this is a good way to get these out of the way, because when we're working with people in a multicultural lens, it's always great to focus on strengths-based work, right? And so highlighting the positives will be really, really important when it comes to working with these clients. So some of the negatives of the machismo culture are their reserved emotions, forms of sexism, forms of dominance, forms of aggression, both verbal and physical. This idea enforces toxic masculinity. Men don't need to feel or learn how to control or express emotions, so they're usually suppressing emotions, and then they're bubbling up until they all spew out, and it's usually just chaos and crisis. Uh, it can excuse violence towards women or the LGBTQ plus community. It's positively correlated to stress and depression levels. So the more somebody identifies with the machismo culture, the more that they're feeling stress and depression. Men are taught that their emotions aren't real, valid, or worthy of being expressed. And as we know, as therapists, this is really, really scary. And this is definitely something that we don't want to instill in any of our clients. And it's something that we usually want to work pretty actively against. But these men have been taught this since birth. This is a tradition that's been carried down through multiple generations. And so it's going to take a lot more than just some basic work. We're going to have to really deep dive into the trauma that has come from being taught these things. So some of the positives that we can use on the strength-based lens is that they usually have a large sense of bravery. They really want others to respect them, and they want to feel like they're honoring others and what others need. They have a lot of dignity, so they take a lot of pride in who they are. They are very responsible for their families, and they feel a large sense of responsibility. They have great skill and ability in sexual acts, which is something that is seen through a cultural lens. And this is something that is often referenced culturally. Now we know that this is not necessarily a true statement and more of a stereotypical statement. But even just great skill and ability in romance, I think they often feel love very passionately and that would be a great thing to use for strengths-based. Loyalty and solidarity among family members. They're very loyal to their family and will do anything for them. So now we're going to touch on Marianismo culture. So the history of Marianismo culture is that the church teaches women in the community that marriage is a sacred covenant and that a woman should not leave her husband even if she is a victim of domestic violence, as it would reflect poorly on her in society. So it's this idea that no woman in the Hispanic culture really wants to leave their husband because it reflects so poorly on them through the church, that divorce is the worst thing that we could do. And this is something, once you get married, you have to stick with it. There's no way out. You have to move through it. You cannot move against it. And so it's this really toxic idea that a woman has no right to get out of a situation that's harmful. The idea of a woman is usually that they are a homemaker, a mother, and a caretaker of the family. You know, you will see that a lot of people in the Hispanic community have large families. And so their idea of being somebody who's a nurturer, someone who's a mother, is very important. It also suggests that women be virtuous, modest, and abstinent until marriage. So there is so much looking down on a woman who is known to be a bit more risky and a bit more sexually active before marriage. And this is something that men do not prefer. This culture believes that men will protect women from others. And so women are often seen as pretty helpless. But this is a strength that, you know, these women have people who are willing to protect them and who work hard to protect them. However, sometimes the things that they needed protected from most are the men that they're with. There's a thought that happiness depends on a man. So if you're not married, this is looked down upon. If you are single, people are going to see you as unhappy, not satisfied, unsuccessful. Defiant behavior is not tolerated from women. So when women are individuals and want to lead a life full of fulfillment, whether it be through their career or through avenues other than a family, this behavior is not tolerated. So once again, we're kind of looking back at like the 1950s idea, right? But the difference here is that we're looking at a collectivist culture. And so we're not just looking through the lens of an individual's culture where we're looking at our importance that we have regarding our self-worth and how important our own success is. We're looking at what is the success of the group? How am I fitting into the group? What is my purpose within the group? Women must be completely faithful to their husbands. However, they should expect that their husbands will be unfaithful to them and will often overlook it. Once again, we're going back to this idea that a woman should not leave their husband, and that divorce is the worst thing that could happen to the family. So even if their husbands are unfaithful, this is part of their husband having needs and being a man and having the right to do these things without being questioned. And the women will be seen as promiscuous and many other negative terms if they are unfaithful. Many women believe that suffering is their obligation. And while we know that suffering is a part of life, their suffering often is more about suppressing abuse and violence and enduring it because they believe it's an obligation for them. In the Marianismo culture, many women question their own decisions and blame themselves for abuse. Lots of gaslighting, like I said, you know, the idea that if somebody hits them, they're going to lie about it, because if they don't lie about it, their spouse is going to lie and make them look like they're crazy. And so they oftentimes feel as though they're carrying guilt and shame about the abuse. Women are afraid of losing the man of their house or bringing social shame to their family, when we're especially looking at the older generation of the Hispanic Latinx culture. We're looking at women who usually haven't had a job and haven't carried much weight in their family. And so to divorce would be to lose their whole source of income and all of their financial support. But then they would also probably lose their family because divorce is just so looked down upon. Women live with the unconscious biases and prejudice against women themselves. So they're looking at the other women in their life and looking down upon them, or even their own daughters, having a bias against them, thinking, oh, they're not going to amount to as much, and really making sure that they stay within the roles of the culture. Women's beliefs are often influenced by their religion. As we know, Catholicism is very prominent in the Latinx and Hispanic cultures. And women in society in general, set standards around their daughters' pureness and submissiveness. And so making sure that they know their place, but also are remaining abstinent as well, is how they're going to increase their daughter's worth. Some of the outcomes of machismoism is that young boys are learning that expressing love, crying, fear, and vulnerability are weaknesses. One of the clients that I worked with was a younger child, and this was very difficult for them to express emotions. And so it was really important for me to educate myself on how do we start to gently reverse the generational trauma instead of just throwing a completely new book at them and saying, well, you have to adhere to society's rules, because the rules that they had been living by under the household, the roof of a first generational parent, was very different than what they were learning at school and what was being implemented through the law. And so it's really important to ease them into this, because otherwise sometimes it can cause more damage, just completely reversing their world upside down. These kids are looking at their parents as heroes, as their role models, and to break that image quickly can cause rebellion, and it can cause defiance, and it can cause feelings of resentment towards a counselor. A lot of mothers are teaching their sons that they need to be strong, not just in the Hispanic Latinx culture, in all cultures. This is something that we've addressed just universally as something that needs to be addressed, and that we need to be teaching men that it's okay to show emotions. Showing anger equals strength in the machismo culture, and aggression helps you gain a reputation in your surroundings. So the more violent you are with others, the more that you stand your ground, the more that you don't let others walk all over you, the more that you're going to have a good reputation where people are respecting you, where you're dominant, where you're being rewarded for this aggression. The machismo culture values pride, but also coldness. So, valuing pride in what you have and what you've done, being grateful for that, but not showing that emotion, and not necessarily, having these moments where you express love or even happy tears. There is often a lack of self-confidence in the machismo culture. It's a lot of high expectations that would be very difficult for anyone to live up to. The idea that you shouldn't have emotions is just completely impossible. And so having to try to always achieve that can feel as though you're always failing. Men are seen as the family stability and support, and that's just outrageous expectations as well. They have no other support coming in from a spouse sometimes, or they're not being supported by other people in their family. And so even as children, boys are taught that they need to be playing a part in the stability and support of their family. A 2021 study from the California State University focused on Latinx adults and indicated a strong linkage between higher machismo levels and elevated levels of stress and depression. So it's like we said earlier, there's that positive correlation where the more they feel they identify with the machismo culture, the more that they're reporting levels of stress and depression. Data suggests a significant negative association between machismo and education levels. So as machismoism rises, as they identify more with the machismo culture, the more likely they are to be less educated. So usually, like these pride and this rebellion, this violence is often getting them in situations where they are not obtaining higher levels of education. And that is kind of something that's looked down upon is being educated, going to school, spending all that money, or being a nerd, right? The stronger you are, the better you will be in the machismo culture. And so they'd rather focus on the reputation rather than education. Upholding self-conceptualizations of manhood that are centrally based in providing financially for family could have drastically negative implications for Latino men as they age, but particularly in midlife. So they feel like they aren't capable of doing this because it's such a strain to have to provide financially. Many of them have several jobs, or they're working just day and night to try to make ends meet. And so we see a lot of stress and depression in midlife, where people feel like they're just not able to get out of the weeds and there's things just aren't getting better. How can we address machismos and marianismos as a society? So as a society, we can interrupt stereotypical phrases such as "that's for girls" or "boys don't cry." These typical phrases that we hear in every culture, we can interrupt them and remind each other gently that it's okay for boys to want to play with girl toys, or it's okay for boys to show emotions. It's okay for girls to want to be successful. We can remember that our parents loved us, and what they passed on to us is what was taught to them years before. So using that generational trauma through a lens of support and, and gentleness to remind our clients that our parents didn't mean to hurt us. Our parents didn't mean to do bad things to us. We can have compassion for them because this is something that they have been taught for so long before. We can accept the perspectives of somebody who's in this society and culture and engage them in a respectful conversation that can shift the family dynamic. So we can help them accept their parents' perspectives as well. So if they start to do the change and they start to feel like they're starting to do the work and really address some of their trauma, and the people around them aren't changing, they can have respectful conversations with these people, but they also need to accept that they cannot change others' perspectives, even if theirs are changing as our client. We can encourage them to make the decisions that best benefit themselves and their family. So sometimes that could mean cutting off family members. Sometimes that could mean keeping them at a distance. Sometimes it could mean that they are engaging with people who they never thought they would have engaged with before. Just reminding them that they know what's best for themselves and their family. We can also encourage men to speak out, act, and change their narratives. When presented in situations where they would typically act a certain way, they can vocalize that they're acting differently and be proud of that. How do we address machismo as counselors? We can encourage our client to explore their heritage. This provides insight into their beliefs and culture. I had a discussion with one of my professors at UNO, Miguel Esteves, and he had given me so much insight about how I could help work with clients of this culture. But, reminding them that there's so much beauty in our heritage, and this has served us before, right? This is part of who we are, and there are other beautiful parts of who we are, and we can now break the cycle and change it and move forward. We can emphasize the positive values the client has and encourage the client to utilize these resources and facilitate adaptive behaviors and personal growth. So working with the ACT therapy a little bit, emphasizing the positive values that they possess, and then working with ACT and strength-based to make sure that what their behaviors are aligning with their values. It is debatable whether or not a male therapist is seen as more viable for machismo men. So just kind of letting the client tell you what they need. If they feel they need a male or a female, letting them tell you what they need just as you would any other client would be important. Don't assume that just because they're a man and they feel this way towards women and men, that they're going to feel that way towards you. Just remember that connection is the most important part of the therapeutic process. And if they aren't connecting with you, that's okay, but that doesn't mean that a Hispanic male is going to be the best fit for them. We don't want to make assumptions. We want to let them make their own choices. Potential barriers do include the client's discomfort in expressing emotional vulnerability, and there's probably often going to be resistance to disclosure in the counseling setting and avoidance of counseling altogether. They might come for a session and then drop off. They might come for 2 sessions and drop off. We really can't control that. All we can control is the tools that we provide to them. And you'll find often that we really need to focus on rapport building first and foremost when working with these clients. We can't just jump in, and we don't want to make it seem like we know more than they know and try to make them feel as though their ideas are wrong. We really want to build that rapport and let them start to engage with these emotions as they feel they're ready to. So this final resource was what I wanted to show. And hopefully it will load here shortly. But Miguel Estevez was the one who I had talked to, that is my teacher at UNO. He teaches a few different courses. And so he went into this podcast called Healing the Hard Way, Why Resilience Starts with Facing the Past. So he talks about his father and coming from El Salvador, and, going through all this as the Civil War is happening. And he does such a great job at talking about how this culture has impacted him. And I think it would be a wonderful, wonderful watch for any counselor to really start to understand what it would be like to work with a client in this culture and develop a broader multicultural lens of working with clients from this culture. So this is something that I would highly suggest for anyone to watch, even just to understand part of, our own Omaha culture, and even understanding, for people who aren't in our field, understanding what goes into obtaining a therapy license and why we get into these different types of therapy. So last but not least, here are my sources that I had used for the presentation. And working with the Latinx and Hispanic populations is something that I feel will be really important work for me to do as somebody who is part of that culture, but also somebody who's biracial. Understanding the different lenses that come with working with the Hispanic culture and the white culture, or working with clients who feel as though they might not belong in either culture. And so I'm really excited to continue to do research in this topic and understand more about how to work with clients in this specific culture, so that we can try to start to tear down these toxic ideas of what masculinity has to look like, and start to remind one another to have self-compassion and feel justified in all of the emotions that we have. Thank you so much for listening.